Thank you, Jacqueline, for that warm introduction. Thank you to the GUD CCPN. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on Disengage, the Embodied Experience and the Iconic Image. My name is Katherine Ohiaeri. At the time of this event, I was a Master's in Architecture student at Kingston School of Art, Kingston University, London. I since graduated the Master's in Architecture. I hold a Bachelor's and a Master's in Architecture from Cambridge University. I am an aspiring architect, also known as an architectural assistant. I will get there in my own time and at my own pace. And I recently researched, studied, and produced a master's dissertation on this topic of the embodied experience, and it was awarded a distinction. Having said all that, I just want to put this disclaimer out there. I want to establish that I am in no way an untouchable authority on this subject and can still learn more about it, even from some of you out there. So I'm looking forward to questions at the end. So a quick overview. I'll introduce what I covered in my dissertation, topics like image over experience, what the embodied experience is, the architects that I profile in this dissertation, Weatherford, Watson, Mann architects, 3 of their many projects, Wetlands, Amnesty, and Astley Castle, and I'll conclude with a few interesting plot twists, and then we will follow with questions and answers. So my abstract, in other words, is that platforms like Instagram portray architecture as just the money shot or the perfect image or the iconic image. Visual perception of architecture as being merely pleasing to the eye is a complete redefinition of architecture, and it threatens the way we design and even practice architecture. It also portrays architecture to those outside the profession as mere spectacle. I assert that this is tragic. Architecture is much more. Many structures today are reduced to an image or mere nickname based solely on their appearance, like the gherkin or the shard. These metonyms are void of the functional experience of the buildings themselves, and yet they are propagated in today's populist media as quote-unquote architecture. As a result, this threatens and in some ways already redefines the very concept of architecture. This is what I mean. This is surrealist painter René Magritte's painting of a pipe. The text underneath the painting reads, "Ceci n'est pas un pipe," which means this is not a pipe. In summary, he challenged the perception of things versus their reality. This is literally not a pipe. It is a representation of one. It is a painting of one, and in this case, it is a pixelated image of one. The painting is entitled "The Treachery of Images." And how true is that statement? Images, if trusted too deeply, can be deceitful and not let on about the full experience of what the image represents. Similarly, this is not the gherkin. This is an image of the gherkin. I, for one, have never really been inside or experienced the building thoroughly for myself, but I've seen this sort of image many times. I'm sure the experience of it is amazing and immersive, but today's culture would portray that the image of the gherkin is good architecture and what architecture is all about, solely based on the photograph. Here are some important definitions. So we have the human condition, which refers to consciousness, the inevitability of death and sorrow as part of life and joy, all locked in time. A definition reads, the characteristics, key events, and situations which compose the essentials of human existence, such as birth, growth, emotionality, aspiration, conflict, and mortality. Existential or existentialism is a philosophical theory or approach which emphasizes the existence of the individual person as a free, responsible agent, determining their own development through acts of will. It's the idea of existing, being here, being alive, and what that means. And finally, phenomenology is the study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first-person point of view. So first-hand experience, in other words, the embodied experience. So a brief introduction. What is the embodied experience? It is literally talking about our body moving through a space and all that it experiences as it does so. It is also known as phenomenology. Our 5 primary senses, our 5 primary and notable senses are sight, touch, hearing, taste, and smell. Sense of sight. How is this particular sense preferred over the others? Well, just like look at the imagery and the images and how visually overstimulated we are in this generation in particular. We scroll through image after image and are flooded with pictures on a daily basis. How does this affect the way we design? Well, we generally consider how buildings and spaces will look rather than how they will feel and be experienced in reality. How does this affect the way we teach about design? Even the pedagogy of architecture is affected. We prioritize the sleek rendered image and the computer-generated interiors almost as though they are the final product, whereas the building, experienced over many generations in all its seasons, is the final product. And who are Witherford Watson men? Well, I shall discuss this a bit later. They are the 2013 Sterling Prize winning architectural practice that I profile in my dissertation. Here's another disclaimer. To study the body with all its magnificent facets, senses, and computations is a gargantuan task. It is huge, and no detailed explanation would do sufficient justice, not even today. Finnish architect and esteemed architectural thinker Juhani Palasma briefly summarizes these processes as unconscious internalization, identification, and projection. But again, he is constrained by metaphor, as are all of us, in fact. Metaphor is representative or symbolic of something and not the thing itself. A quote from the book Metaphors We Live By reads, "Metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but in thought and action. Our ordinary conceptual system is in terms of which we both think and act is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. Images are metaphorical. They are snapshots of the entire experience. They are insights and prompts, but they are not the total reality, and thus images can only show and convey so much. A picture says 1,000 words, but are 1,000 words even enough? Who out there likes philosophy? I admit it's grown on me with the more I understand it better. Well, 20th century philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty focused on the body in space with all its experiences. Although he never specifically wrote on the subject of architecture, his philosophies on phenomenology, which just means the embodied experience, as derived from his antecedents like Martin Heidegger, have many applications for architects today. A quote from the famous Le Corbusier reads, "Architecture is experienced as one roams about in it and walks through it. So true is this that the architectural works can be divided into dead and living ones, depending on whether the law of roaming through has not been observed, or whether, on the contrary, it has been brilliantly obeyed." My dissertation is a celebration of true architecture, despite the apparent superficialities of new media that attempt to redefine and dilute it. It is thus important to define what this true architecture is, using both theory and contemporary case studies that capture the embodied experience and contrast it with the obsession with the visual that mainstream culture primarily offers. Witherford Watson Man architects are a 21st century architectural practice that are situated in this complex era of image obsession. However, they aim to remain true to the established art of architecture, empathetic design for the embodied experience. So in summary, the embodied experience is about the body in a space and how the body responds to that environment. Sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. These are our primary senses. Sight is preferred because of the delusion current and inundation of images we are exposed to on a daily basis. We now tend to design based on how buildings will look rather than how they will be experienced in reality. This is a sort of lazy approach to design, given the magnificent facets of the human body. And in teaching architecture, we glorify the 3D renders, the imagery, and the representation of the space, rather than how the space will inspire responses from us through experience. So that covers my introduction. We'll move on to image over experience, the irony of the engagement era. The current cultural landscape is defined by the internet and social media. It's basically about the virtual experience and what we see. The word engage means to participate or become involved in something. I shall discuss in a moment what the culture of imagery and photography is doing to our way of life. And synesthesia is basically the crossover of our senses. Social media has made worse the problem we have with the floods of images we're exposed to on a daily basis and how we prioritize what we see as opposed to what we experience. I've already mentioned the definition of the word engage. And ironically, the term engagement is used to describe when users on platforms like Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, and such like scroll through image after image and respond with their endorsement in the form of a like, comment, or retweet. But this is not engagement, really. It's hardly a participation or involvement with the world. Additionally, we now have an influencer in the wild mentality. So there's an Instagram handle called Influence in the Wild. It captures people in hilarious and compromising positions trying to get that perfect picture. So one video captured a woman sprawled on the floor of a bowling alley in front of a bowling lane, presumably trying to get that perfect perspectival shot in front of the bowling lane and bowling pins. But it just seemed a little bit ridiculous. Some people risk life and death for that perfect selfie, for that perfect picture. Our perception of reality has completely changed. People lament how we are not living in the moment anymore, and they're true. They're right. It can be argued that we perceive and preempt the world and our surroundings as a set of potential photographs, as American writer and philosopher Susan Sontag once said, which in turn has already augmented our grasp of reality. Additionally, perceiving an image of a building in a pixelated form, especially through our phones and screens, affects our neurological makeup for one. It is also inadequate in conveying everything about the reality of the experience of the building. This is something that we must accept, or we risk defining architecture by its mere aesthetics and visual perception. So back to synesthesia. Synesthesia is the production of a sense impression relating to one sense or part of the body by stimulation of another sense or part of the body. Some people, even Kanye West, are diagnosed with synesthesia, which basically means as opposed to seeing colors and hearing sounds, they actually see colors, see sounds, and hear colors. They might say, that's a lovely sound of yellow, or I see this melody and harmony. However, it can be argued that we all have this element of merging of our senses, since we experience all our senses all at once and not in compartments. Putting my hands on the table, I simultaneously hear a thud, feel the cool of the table against my skin, see my hands rested on the table, and so on. French philosopher Gaston Bachelard once described it as a polyphony of the senses, again alluding to the synesthetic nature of our perception. So to summarize this section, images are important, just as sight is important, as part of the embodied experience. In architecture, images are the basis of our communication of ideas, concepts, and deliverables, often preceding the construction of an actual building. William Mann of Witherford Watson Mann Architects discusses this idea of projection prophesying in his talk at Wuppertal. However, since the modern proliferation of digital media, the impact and influence of the image is everywhere, and there is more emphasis on capturing the perfect image than on the subject of the image itself. Style, lighting, composition, other things are all aspects that should have the perfect equilibrium for an image to be deemed marketable and well received today. William Mann, when I interviewed him for a number of hours, discussed how we have become the servant of the tool. Images are tools in a sense, and we have become subject to them. Okay, everyone, here's some theory and philosophy. Stick with me, it's good and it's relevant. This section is called the embodied experience integrated with the world. The lived body, what does this mean? Body in space is not just relating to anatomy. The body comes with all its experiences, learned and acquired. Merleau-Ponty spoke of the lived body and how through habitual action we become engaged with, familiar with, and part of the world. Our joys, our sadness, our environments, our likes and dislikes, and so on, these are all shaped by interacting with our world. How do the body and the world relate to one another? The body is our primary connector with our world. They are in direct relation to one another and are in inseparable symbiosis with one another. Can we compartmentalize experience and our senses? In a word, no. Merleau-Ponty's view was that the amalgam of the intellectual, the rational, the sensory experiences of living in our bodies is not split into individual realms or possible to compartmentalize. It is impossible to separate the visual from the body and impossible to separate the mind from the body too. He called the attempt to divide such entities an artificial abstraction. This being the case, he probably would have called the image obsession of our world, of our perception of architecture today, the ultimate artificial abstraction. We can't separate sight from the body and idealize it. And what is phenomenology, the embodied experience, characterized by? The embodied experience is characterized by action. I shall explain. In today's world, we irrationally attempt to magnify and separate the visual from the body with little success and much confusion. Contrary to the popular saying by René Descartes, je pense donc je suis, translated I think therefore I am, Merleau-Ponty took on a more practical approach where he considered having a body and living in our bodies a connector to the world and not a schism between mind, body, and world. The French poet Noel Arnaud encapsulated this concept of situation in the world by saying, Je suis l'espace où je suis. I am the space where I am. Images are theoretical. Action is practical. An image of the building will tell you in theory what it looks like. Going to the same building and experiencing it for yourself will tell you practically how it ought to be experienced through actions. Juhani Palasma says, the floor is an invitation to stand up. The door invites us to enter and pass through. The window to look out and see. The staircase to ascend and descend. Notice all the verbs, which are action verbs he uses. This is architecture. This is what a building does. To experience architecture is to engage with it. To engage with architecture is to actively participate in it through actions. These actions are acquired and in some ways then recur through memory, familiarity, the subconscious, and subtle adaptation. Merleau-Ponty framed the concept of the embodied experience through recurring action well when he said, when I move about in my house, I know immediately and without any intervening discourse that to walk toward the bathroom involves passing close to the bedroom, or that to look out the window involves having the fireplace to my left. In this small world, each gesture or each perception is immediately situated in relation to 1,000 virtual coordinates. If this is the case, that architecture is much more than the visual and action is what ought to be prioritized, then how do architects design buildings that are inspiring to inhabit? How do architects design buildings that nurture such viscerality? Viscerality meaning based on physical life rather than virtual, imaginary, or fantasy. An example of this might be the novel Oversimplicity of Architecture by Mies van der Rohe. Now, Mies van der Rohe was a pioneer architect in his own right, but critically looking at his work, it appears that his designs offer less stimulation for seasonal activity and routines because of the vagueness of his open plan spatial designs. In essence, architecture that is too open-ended and lacks a concept of different cycles of change is uninspiring and does not engage the user's creativity. Peter Eisenman favors a more stimulating architecture that inspires an intricate and untested series of actions in what is known as critical functionalism. At this point, I shall introduce the work of contemporary architects Rutherford Watson Man. Architects today need to approach architecture differently. To understand this better, I examine as case studies the work of Rutherford Watson Man to flesh out the aforementioned theoretical considerations. Rutherford Watson Man are a firm of about 20 architectural staff, medium-sized firm based in East London. They won the 2013 RIBA Sterling Prize for the Astley Castle project based in North Warwickshire. On their website, one of their principal tenets as a practice is empathy, saying we design buildings and spaces by imagining how people will experience them. Some of this is skill, a large part is empathy. What makes them unique in this era and offers a counterpoint to the delusion current of superficial architecture is that their approach sets out to create spaces that have qualities that cultivate rich activities and functions. In conversation with William Mann, it is evident that to engage with architecture through the embodied experience is to engage with a story. This would make the architect a novelist, he says. He explains you're inevitably doing it for other people. You've just got to try and stand in their shoes. Some of that is just imagining how spaces they are using spaces, moving in between spaces, etc. And when the novelist has to respect some logic of fiction, the architect has to respect some logic of construction or gravity or accepting what's there. William Mann brings up in an interview that understanding their clients has always been the key to designing their spaces. He simply says, there are actually some steps that resist objectification or resist the reduction to images, and that is just the architect and the client talk to each other. This strangely radical idea. He contends that the image isn't the problem. It's more just what it's asked to do. Contemporary culture demands that the image fulfills the scope of the embodied experience, whereas this is impossible. The three projects that shall be introduced are similar in many ways. They are all adaptation projects that use existing buildings as their starting point. The strength of these projects is that they do not appeal to the modern vision of architecture as imagery alone. For example, their style is not unnecessarily distinct in form, kitschy, or replete with Instagrammable murals and elaborately decorated feature walls that are typical of modern designs. There is a raw honesty in the work of Winifred Watson Mann that does not simply appeal as irresistible magnets for photographers and modern-day influencers. The projects discussed in this dissertation are sincere in their expression and in their choice of materials. In Astley Castle, the selection of timber rafters and delicately chosen brick is sober and balancing in nature. The exterior brick of Amnesty is demure in its grayish and muted hue, slightly differing from the neighboring buildings, gently suggesting a bit of an avant-garde and a sense of doing things differently from the status quo. This matches the sensibilities of Amnesty, yet it's a tame choice that is in harmony with the rest of the buildings next door and the existing factory. Without the exaggeration of garish colors, these projects stand in their purest rawness, without the need for a Las Vegas style-inspired architecture, or appealing with a fantasy-like expression. Plasma details the extent to which contemporary architecture has missed the mark, even in terms of materials, that could make for a more involved embodied experience. Nowadays, the overemphasis on synthetic and manufactured materials is contributing to a compromised materiality that is principally palatable to the eye. He expresses, natural materials, stone, brick, and wood, allow for our vision to penetrate their surfaces and enable us to become convinced of the veracity of matter. Natural materials express their age, as well as the story of their origins and their history of human use. Now I shall delve deeper into these case studies, starting with wetlands. The visitor centre at the heart of the function of the converted Victorian pump station at Walthamstow Wetlands. It is complete with a cafe and exhibition room, as well as educational and event spaces. Through restoration, repair, and care, the original robust brickwork of the pump house is retained, with steel gantries added to the framework to act as connections to the neighbouring rooms and provide expansive views of the landscape, waterways, woodlands, and marshes. The addition of the brick tower is a statement and a landmark element of the design, constructed on the same chimney plinth as the previous one. It houses swift boxes and bat nests, which Winifred Watson Mann assert signals the transformation of the site from infrastructure to ecology. I first visited the renovated pump house, Victorian pump house turned visitor centre on Monday, 9th of August 2021, and arranged to have a tour around the building by its building managers. I shall briefly discuss how the design and architecture inspire the actions that only the body and space can experience. I'll do my best to emphasize these actions as I partake in them through my journey. I cross the road and enter the gates marked through with the rusty wetland signage, shrouded in foliage and animated by a trickling brook on my right. I stroll along the path that directs around the public car park leading to the visitor center. I look up and observe a speeding train go by on an elevated bridge, which obscures the tower that was once visible. I pause and wait patiently for another train to rush by to capture it on camera. I hear the constant clanging of the railway in the background, and the general environment mediates between naturally serene with wind rustling and vegetation and industrially sonorous with raucous trains going by. I navigate along the winding path and discover the understated and unassuming entrance to the visitor center. A certain promenade and an unraveling of a journey unfolds on the approach to the center. I turn a corner and descend the stairs underneath the railway track, and I see the impressive and tangible building in full view. I enter the center's glazed doors. I sense that the Wetlands Visitor Center is a sort of time capsule, retaining elements of its industrial past everywhere in its structural framework, including gauges, pipework, and pumps. This is a deliberate move by the architect who restored the building and adapted it to its current use as a visitor center. And so my dissertation continues as I detail the actions that are inspired by the wetlands building I visited that day. In conversation with William Mann, and with reference to the concept of an old building having a soul, he is careful to note that the building is not alive, and one must be careful with personification of a non-living object. Having said that, the imagination of the individual moving through the building and is aware or made aware of such history through the observation of old relics of the past is stimulated. They can have a fruitful, active engagement with the building that calls upon memory, history, storytelling, and other inspirations. Witherford Watson Mann embraced the notion of passage of time in their delivery of their projects, such as Wetlands. And as seen in Astley Castle, evaluated later in this dissertation, this concept as it pertains to the human condition truly comes to fruition. Moving on to Amnesty. I first visited Witherford Watson Mann's Amnesty International headquarters building off New Inn Yard in East London on Tuesday, the 10th of August 2021. It is a converted furniture factory, and just as with the Wetlands projects, I shall discuss how the design and architecture by Witherford Watson Mann inspire actions that shall emphasize the corresponding verbs that relate to each activity I partake through in my journey. I walk in as though I have not left the outside world, as light streams in at every opportunity from the heavens, from the skylights, through the large openings on the sides of the building. I look through the window and realize the building points both inwards and outwards to the community and the world it serves, whether with clear stories, standard windows, or skylights. I situate myself in the surrounding context due to the many carefully placed openings around. I grasp that there is a consistent sense that the building is uplifted by hope, especially by constant beams of light. I immediately sense the ethos of the building, and in conversation with William Mann of Witherford Watson Mann, he clarifies this, saying it's about the collective struggle. Conference auditorium, according to Mann, is specifically designed around the idea of hosting and capacity. I stand in the atrium, in the overflow space, and feel its vastness, its height, and its accommodation. I exit the conference room auditorium and walk back into the reception. I notice the change of volumes with the mostly open plan area. Different zones, from the stepped-up cafe to the lower ground level, are mainly expressed by adapting volumes, although they share the same ceiling. This is as opposed to creating rooms and demarcations from enclosures made of solid walls, which would affect the atmospheric links between all the spaces. I access conference rooms and climb up a few steps that run along the cafe, which is now a staff kitchen and hangout space due to the pandemic. I consider the impressive nature of some of the spaces that seem infinitely tall due to the many skylights that open to the sky above. And so my description continues again. The main approach to the design and experience of the Amnesty building is centered around the action and hosting and how to accommodate large groups of people. This lends itself to the large overflow spaces from the main event room that can be easily appropriated for this use. It became paramount that the design should include a main conference room, creating spaces that are centered around socializing, mingling, and networking activity inform the structuring of the zones in the design. William Mann adds, a lot of it is quite practical. It's a part of a rich sensory experience. The collective has a strong sensory dimension. In the context of events, you have listening, watching, you have gathering before, and you have lingering after. The spaces in the building are stimulating enough to make people feel like they have entered through the backstage door, where usually back of house and all the mechanics are. This allows members and non-members alike to feel part of the conversation of the organization, reflected in its intentional architecture. The essence of the space is to feel part of the conversation and included in the discourse of human rights activism. There are no fireworks or engaging Instagrammable murals. The decision about space, volume, human interaction, essence, and material tectonics are all tempered with a sobriety that makes this building truly fit for the purpose of amnesty. Now, moving on to the final case study of Astley Castle, my personal favorite. I first visited Weatherford Watson Man's Astley Castle just outside Coventry's town centre in Nuneaton on Saturday, 8th of January 2022. Just as with the previous projects, I shall discuss the design and the architecture and how they inspire actions, and shall emphasize the corresponding verbs that relate to each activity I partake in on my journey. I arrived at Astley Castle by car, being driven up from Coventry city centre. After I see many winding roads and the vast landscape, I approach the wooden gate of the property and behold the site of the magnificent ruin and modern intervention of Astley Castle. Against the bright hue of the green grass, I am awed by the unmissable statement of the structure. I capture the views of the building on my camera to trigger memories later. I behold the dignified modesty of the building and pass through the wooden gate. I view it closer. I stroll across the wet grass towards the structure. I feel the landscape and the sky stretch out endlessly on all sides. Castle has pride of place. I notice the Church of St. Mary the Virgin to my right and the gravestones projecting out of the ground towards the heaven. I move towards the gate of the main habitable structure. I push open the gate leading to the main building. I am haunted by the hollows, the evidence of char of the fire that once gutted the original Norman castle, and the fractured ruinous sandstone. Still, I am comforted and relieved by the modern intervention and its attempt to honor the ruin, give it life, and provide a civilized inhabitation. I am deeply affected by the building in full view before my body, and I begin to explore it and develop an intimacy with it. I study the castle with my body by moving around it. I pass under archways. I run my hands across the roughness of the exterior of the building. I look up to the heavens of the alfresco dining area drenched in the morning's rain. And so my description continues. The building gently tugs at the heart and stirs up nostalgia, an ode to the human condition and the frailty and transience of life itself. Weatherford Watson Man have resisted an aestheticization of the ruin and the subsequent new addition, an approach which is in the opposite of typical contemporary attitude that makes us aesthetes, as Alain de Botton says in his book, The Architecture of Happiness. Rather than a slickly advertised picture-perfect architecture that resists our mortality and frailty, the material selection and volumetric choices resonate deeply and reveal the brutally honest, ruinous castle in all its temporal glory. The castle stands as an emblem of our impermanence and the inevitable passage of time with all its uncertainties, joys, and perils. For example, the moves by Weatherford Watson Man to embrace external effects with an alfresco dining area open to the elements, hugged by the polished brick and ruin of the castle. The infinite ceiling of this dining area contrasts the comforting low ceiling of some of the enclosed bedrooms. These changes in volumes are prevalent in the structure and often signal a moving into a different space with a new atmosphere. The entire project demonstrates evidence of an extremely intimate and dedicated survey of an existing ruin. To accomplish this, a watertight, inhabitable, and comfortable building amongst the destruction of the old castle is also a testament of the diligent, impressive work of the architect, design team, and builders. The building inspires actions that are both celebratory and yet also mundane. The rough ruin allows for a comfortable inhabitation, while something about the new addition engenders a more sophisticated modern living. There is unity, but at the same time a sort of tension, as William Mann describes it. The uneven and untamed surfaces of sandstone jut out into the spaces and create a sense of freedom. There are flashes and reveals of ruin in amongst the crisply yet respectful addition of modern brick. The added brick is small, seamless in its tone and hue, and ordered and compared with the shambolic original stonework. Alain de Botton, in his book The Architecture of Happiness, states that we are never far from damp stains and cracked ceilings, shattered cities, and rusting dockyards. Astley Castle reveals that much of the plight of contemporary Instagrammable architecture is a battle with our fragmented and fraying human condition. To accomplish this, contemporary architecture denies much interaction with the buildings, engages mostly the sense of sight, and prioritizes aesthetics. Creating a sterile, perfect image does not override our fleetingness, nor does it preserve our life. To quote Pelasma, who expresses this same thought, buildings of this technological era usually deliberately aim at ageless perfection, and they do not incorporate the dimension of time or the unavoidable and mentally significant processes of aging. This fear of the traces of wear and age is related to our fear of death. The image on the screen now shows the fire that gutted out Astley Castle before the survey and architectural intervention of Witherford Watson Man. Witherford Watson Man, on the other hand, rather than reinforcing the erosion of existential meaning and avoiding the confrontations with their existential reality, they embrace this fundamental aspect of life and architecture. William Mann expresses how buildings have a complexity and a richness that is multi-sensory that works across time as well. Witherford Watson Man achieved this with a sensibility and a material expression that allow one to ponder, muse, and act upon the building itself while moving through it. Astley Castle rises like a phoenix out of the ashes of tragedy and fiery destruction. The undertaking of this project, the approach by the architects, and the execution of the final construction is ideal in phenomenological understanding as it fully encompasses and understands the nature of the human condition. Pelasma contends that this is critical in the designer spaces that have architectural integrity. One can face the inevitable brevity of life reflected in the castle's decaying spaces with grace and comfort. So everyone, we made it. It's time to conclude this work. Critical to the arguments of my dissertation, it is important that each of Witherford Watson Man's buildings were visited in person to engage with them physically and with the insight of the embodied experience. Now, I mentioned some plot twists right at the beginning, and here they are. The first is that the subtle irony of my dissertation is that the buildings are inevitably captured in photographs and in written musings. But this is only done as second-hand studies for research purposes and not substitutes for the total embodied experience. Nevertheless, through this assessment, one can deduce that metaphorical representations of architecture in the forms of images, musings, and photographs are secondary to the experiences of the actual building in the real world. The point of my dissertation is twofold. Firstly, indeed, by disregarding the movement of actively engaging with a building in person, inevitably architecture becomes lifeless and reduced to a mere likable image. This is a tragedy. Secondly, the complexity and richness of experiencing a building can be enhanced and directed by the work of an architect's meticulous design through material, spatial, tectonic, and experiential qualities about life and architecture. The embodied experience and the projects that engage the concept well are not only in the ability of the architects or the users to wax poetic and metaphorically about the building, but rather the actions that the architecture inspire that lend itself to a critically engaged inhabitation. Phenomenological architecture with a sensibility about it is situated in this image-obsessed context appears richer, valuable, and novel, though not actually novel at all. Second plot twist, life and death. Witherford Watson Man embraced the tensions, conflicts, and inevitabilities embedded in our human condition. This is critical to phenomenological understanding. Time, decay, and even the certainty of death can be the architect's downfall or tool when designing structures. Using architecture as the medium through which we situate ourselves on the planet, through scale, history, volume, and materiality, we can also deduce the brevity of our lives from buildings. It is important to tell a story of history through architecture and call to mind the timeline of human existence just by allowing buildings to age and express their lifespan naturally. Astley Castle is a good example. Winifred Motterman accept the externalities of the fire destruction, the weather and the elements, the seasons, the deterioration that comes with human use, and so on, to allow their choice of materials to age, weather, and even grow moss in various seasons of life. As described earlier, this goes against the common current of contemporary architecture that is concerned with an illusionistic and falsified plastic expression and perfection. Finally, this is a call to action and a guide for the young aspiring architects scrolling on Instagram, and likewise the interested individuals saving pictures on Pinterest. This digital and ocular-centric perception of architecture is not true architecture per se. William Mann puts it this way: the building is only as clever or as good as it's experienced to be. No matter what the book says, no matter what the photograph says, it is that kind of experience. It comes down to that experience of it. The embodied experience is essential to grasp a building and the making of it too. The common idioms, actions speak louder than words, applies. As the same can be said about the experience of architecture. Architecture is part of the world we live in and engage with. We are part of the world and thus a part of architecture. Thank you.